Morning, and welcome to the Western Energy Imbalance Market Governance Review Committee meeting. Please note that all audio connections are muted at this time to minimize background noise. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Burton Gross with the California ISO. Please go ahead.
Bert, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry about that, double muting. Good morning, everybody. This is Burton Gross at the California ISO, and I'll just cover a couple of logistical items and then turn it over to the chair, Chair Hampton. So first, if we could do the roll call, I'll go in alphabetical order, starting with the voting members and then followed by the non-voting members. So Michelle Beck.
Present.
Tony Braun. Tony Braun, are you present? Perhaps we'll come back to Tony. Andrew Campbell.
Present.
Suzanne Cooper.
Present.
Eric Eisenman.
Present.
Therese Hampton.
Here.
Amanda Ormond.
Here.
Lisa Tawney.
Here.
I've been informed that Rob Taylor is unavailable, so I'll move on to Pam Sporborg.
Present.
I just realized I also went out of alphabetical order, so I apologize for that. Rebecca Wagner.
Good morning. I'm here.
Good morning. Cameron Yurkowski.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, and then the non-voting members, Angelina Golitseva.
Present.
And John Prescott.
I'm here.
And I guess I should just check one more time, going back to Tony Braun to see if he is on the line yet.
If you are dialed in, if you can please press #2. And it looks like Tony is not with us.
All right. All right. Well, in any event, we do have a quorum to move forward, so we should, I suppose, move forward. The next agenda item is an opportunity for any public comment on issues that are not on the agenda for today. So if there is any such public comment, now would be the time.
As a reminder, if you would like to make a comment, you can do so by clicking on the raise hand icon, or if you're dialed into the phone line, please press #2. At this time, there are no hands raised.
Okay, then moving right along to the next agenda item, which is the approval of the February 17th, 2022 general session minutes. And for that, I will. It's only the voting members that need to vote, but I'll go through the same list with the voting members, skipping those who are not here today. So Michelle Beck. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I forgot. I first need to have a motion to approve by one of the voting members.
I move to approve this general session minutes.
Okay, and then a second?
I second.
I second.
I think I heard Eric first, so I'll give him that honor. All right, then moving along to approval, Michelle Beck.
Yes.
Tony's not available, I think. Andrew Campbell.
I am, Mr. Gross.
Oh, it sounds like Tony is now there. Tony, we're voting on the minutes if you want to vote.
Aye.
Okay, and I heard Andrew. Suzanne Cooper.
Approve.
Eric Eisenman.
Aye.
Therese Hampton.
Aye.
Amanda Ormond.
Aye.
Lisa Tawney.
Aye.
Pam Sporborg.
Aye.
Rebecca Wagner.
Aye.
And Cameron Yurkowski.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. The minutes have been approved. And I can turn it over to you, Therese. Thank you for everyone's patience.
Terrific. Thanks, Bert. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We wanted to hold this meeting a couple of things, right? We have consistently heard feedback that you would like for us to have more general session meetings and to kind of hear from us about the process that we're going through. So today we are going to give you a bit of a process update of where we're at. But first, we are interested in hearing from the EDIM market design team on where they're at and what they've heard. We have said from the beginning we think it's important that market design informs governance, and we heard that actually in the comments from all of you as well. So this is our briefing from the EDIM market design team and an opportunity for us to ask questions that we think are important to understand relative to the governance options that we're going to put forward. And so thank you to Milos for putting this presentation together for us, and I'm going to turn it over to Milos to give this presentation, and then the GRC members will engage on this.
All right, thank you, Therese, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to present today. My name is Milos Kosanets, and I'm the Regional Market Sector Manager and leading the entire, or the overall EDIM initiative, but we have a lot of support from different work groups internally and policy leads as well across different topics. So really appreciate the opportunity to provide you an EDIM briefing and as well provide some of the insights into the design discussions as you embark on the journey of designing the EDIM governance structure. I'm going to provide an overview of the EDIM process, timeline, and where we are today, then provide an overview of the stage that we just concluded, which is the stakeholder working groups. And I've also invited some stakeholders then to provide you with some more pointed insights and sharing their perspectives on each one of the working groups that we just concluded. And you will hear from them about some of the design discussions, their perspectives on those topics, on the working groups, and again, to give you some of those insights into the design. And then I'm going to conclude with a brief next step slide, kind of effectively, how are we moving towards the publication of the straw proposal, which is the next step in the overall process. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So some of you may be familiar with this slide if you've been following some of our EDIM discussions, but we launched the EDIM initiative officially in November of last year, of 2021. And the first step in that stakeholder process was really the launch of the stakeholder working groups, which are focused on key design elements of the EDIM. And we wanted to leverage stakeholder perspectives and ideas early on in the process to ultimately inform development of that straw proposal. We concluded these working groups 2 weeks ago, and on the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit more about these. But now we're in the process of developing the straw proposal that is slated for publication in the late April timeframe. The overall policy design will take place throughout 2022, and we will go through iterations of proposals informed by stakeholder feedback. We may be able to leverage additional working groups as we go through the process, more focused design topics, but we're targeting to take this item ultimately to the ISO board and the EM governing body at the end of 2022 for decision. And then to the extent that we have approval, we will then make a filing with FERC in Q1 of 2023, and then 2023 is largely dedicated to implementation activities related to the EDIM. And then ultimately all these activities will put us in a position to be able to launch the EDIM and open it up for participation in 2024. Let's go to the next slide, please. So before we go into more detailed insights into the working groups, I wanted to just at a high level talk a bit about the working group process that we just concluded. And I wanted to acknowledge the stage of the overall process that we just concluded, which is these 3 stakeholder working groups. As I noted, we wanted to leverage stakeholder perspectives and ideas on key elements of the EDIM design early on in the process, which is not necessarily the process that we usually go through when we're doing other initiatives. We may leverage working groups with some initiatives, but largely the ISO usually publishes a straw proposal and then through formal stakeholder comments, receives that input and goes through the iteration of different stages of the proposal. But we wanted to leverage stakeholder working groups early on in the process, really to get those ideas. We recognize that the EDIM is a broad topic. It has a lot of tentacles, a lot of different challenging issues that we thought that we would leverage those stakeholder ideas and perspectives and really develop a common understanding coming out of the working groups across the different issues that we discussed. And while we may not have developed consensus through these working groups on a particular singular framework, I believe that we have developed that common understanding on issues across the different topics and some of the very challenging issues. I think we're in a much better position for the ISO to put together a straw proposal, and I think the stakeholder community is in a better position through developing this common understanding and through these working groups than we otherwise would have been had we not had these stakeholder working groups. Had we simply gone out with a straw proposal, I think it would have been difficult early on to incorporate some of those stakeholder perspectives, but also, some of these challenging topics without developing that common understanding would have been very difficult to digest, and we may not have received, very robust comments. So I think by leveraging the working groups early on, I think it's going to help us through the rest of the stakeholder process, and particularly in this first phase of the straw proposal. The working groups started in January, right at the turn of 2022, January 3rd. I think that's a Monday, if I remember correctly. And then we concluded them just a couple of weeks back on March 17th. Each working group met twice per week for 2 hours each meeting, and that's 60 meetings over an 11-week period. We did slow down briefly the cadence to 1 week of meeting per working group in the middle of it, but 60 meetings over 11 weeks, that's 120 hours of meetings in the working groups where we had robust engagement with over 100 stakeholder participants in each one of those working group meetings. And I do want to take a moment just to acknowledge again all the stakeholders that participated. It's 120 hours of working group meetings, but stakeholders put in time before and after those working groups to form perspectives, provide presentations, and have a participate in a robust dialogue during those working groups. The three working groups focused on key elements of the design. Working group 1 focused on resource sufficiency and supply commitment. This group discussed different components of the resource sufficiency evaluation design, but it also discussed level of confidence in market transfers. And what is that level of confidence in transfers? What should be that level of confidence in transfers coming out of the market as parties rely on the market to serve load and meet other commitments? Working group 2 focused on another key topic, which is the transmission commitment and compensation topic. The group discussed how transmission is made available to the market for optimization of transfers to derive those benefits among participating EDIM balancing authority areas. But it also discussed what should be the compensation structure for the transmission that is ultimately made available, among other topics that they touched on. And then finally, working group 3 focused on GHG accounting. This group, again, had robust discussion on different concepts related to GHG accounting. This group heard from California and Washington state regulators who made presentations as well. And we heard a lot of stakeholder perspectives and a lot of stakeholder presentations on the appropriate GHG accounting framework. And I think there have been very good, robust discussions in that working group, coming out ultimately, I think, with a couple of key options to consider further in the straw proposal and the stakeholder process. I will note that yesterday we did publish the working group summary reports for each one of these working groups that captured really the working group progression, the different concepts and the topics that were discussed. So if anybody's interested in taking a look at those, that should really summarize the different topics that were covered and some of the perspectives that were shared on those topics. Both these reports, as well as the working group discussions that we just went through, are really going to help inform this development of the comprehensive straw proposal. And we're going to carry concepts and options coming out of these working groups into the straw proposal to seek some more formal feedback, recognizing that the working groups moved fairly quickly through a lot of topics. There was not opportunity, aside from orally engaging in these groups and providing some informal feedback, but there was not that opportunity to provide that more formal feedback on the broader scope of issues that were discussed. And that is going to be the opportunity in the straw proposal, where we're going to carry a number of these concepts and options with us into that straw proposal. So this is where kind of I conclude those discussions about the process and the working groups. And the next step is in this presentation is a number of stakeholders are going to share their perspectives and insights into the working groups, into each one of the working groups. But before we jump there, I wanted to pause here and see if there are any questions on anything I covered regarding process and overall timeline and just the overall working group structure that we just went through.
Lush, if I could, can you hear me? I'm curious. I saw a survey went out to working group participants. I wondered how you're thinking about what you'll do with that feedback. How you're thinking about incorporating that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate. Great question. You know, I think throughout the working group process that we just concluded, you know, we had a number of lessons learned on our end. You know, putting aside the cadence, which was not ideal. You know, recognizing again, 11 weeks of 6 working group meetings a week. But I think we learned a number of things about how to potentially improve these meetings, ranging from dedicating some additional time for level setting early on in the working groups, but as well as what I think worked in the working groups was putting forward ideas to stimulate some discussion as opposed to putting forward a blank slate. We recognize that whether stakeholders or the ISO put forward concepts for consideration, it stimulated discussion better, at least in the context of the EDIM. So we're going to take a number of the feedback that stakeholders provided to really try to improve this process. I think we envision that the working groups are going to be an integral part of our stakeholder process going forward, and we'll look to leverage these not only in the rest of the EDIM initiative, and hopefully we'll have opportunities for more focused working groups rather than some of these more broad topics that we started with. But as we look to leverage these going forward in the EDIM initiative and other initiatives, that feedback is going to help us make these a bit more robust and improve how we're leveraging these and engaging with stakeholders through the working groups.
Milosh, it's Eric. I've got I'm not sure if I have a question or a comment. So I've been following the ISO for a very long time. A lot of complex initiatives, the timelines of completing the initiative have been extended over the years. The timeline for the EDIM design certainly impacts the work of the GRC. This is as complex as it can get. And, you know, I would encourage you, I'm fine with the timeline you have now that you showed a slide or two before, but I would encourage you that if you see it's going to slip, be realistic about when you're going to finish this, when you're going to bring it to the board. You've got, you know, fourth quarter now for bringing this to the board and the governing body, and that's fine for now. But please, I would encourage you and all the stakeholders, be realistic, and if it needs to be made a little bit later, you know, don't tell us on December 1st. You know, figure that out earlier than that. It's more important to get it right than to get it on time. So that's just a comment.
No, appreciate it. Yeah, thank you, Eric.
And that'll affect
thank you, Eric, for that.
Thanks, Milosh.
Yeah, no, thank you, Eric, for that. Yeah, and we're certainly open to that. I think we've noted that we're going to continue reevaluating the timeline as we move forward through the initiative. I think we do recognize it is fairly aggressive, but you know, once we get the straw proposal out, get some of the stakeholder feedback, I think we'll take another look at it there based on some of, you know, how far apart or how close are we on some of these challenging issues. And that's certainly something we'll keep in mind. Again, we'll continue reevaluating as we move forward.
Thank you.
This is Therese Hampton. I had a similar maybe question or comment on the schedule, which is you can see we've got late April, the comprehensive straw proposal, and then Q4 before the boards. And imagine there's interim steps in there. So once you get comments back on the straw proposal, I assume there's an assessment of the schedule and some conversation with the GRC would be helpful on that so that we can kind of continue to operate in parallel.
That's right. That's right. No, thank you for that as well. Yeah. You know, as we get the stakeholder, we publish the straw proposal. We also, as you'll see on the last slide, once we get to that, we're extending as well the comment period, recognizing that the comprehensive straw proposal is very likely going to be fairly lengthy. So we're extending the comment period. And yes, once those comments come in and we take stock of them, we'll identify that next step and we'll reevaluate the timeline as well at that stage.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no more questions, maybe we can move on to the next slide. So what we wanted to do next is, and we invited a number of stakeholders to share their perspectives and provide a briefing to you of each one of the working groups and provide you a bit of more insight into some of the design discussions and which topics they find important and key as we move forward through the process. And so for Working Group 1, we invited Bobby Olson from Salt River Project. Kevin Smith, representing Bank, will provide an update on Working Group 2. And then Mary Winke will provide an update on Working Group 3. And I think Mary's going to join us closer to the noon hour or so, but I anticipate, feel free to ask questions after each one of these working group reports. So with that, let me turn it over to Bobby. And Bobby, thank you again for your willingness and taking the time to provide an update.
Sure, thank you, Milos. So Bobby Olson with SRP, and I'd like to first start with the concept that EDIM, this first working group phase was an intense process for a wide variety of stakeholders. There was significant engagement and significant discussion, both within the working group meetings, but also on the side of working group meetings and work to coordinate. The pace of play actually presented some challenges with respect to coordinating around the working group meetings, but we do appreciate that CAISO, as Milos referenced, did take a moment to kind of slow down in the middle of it to allow for a little bit more coordination. We think this was a novel approach, but it was helpful for making sure that there was common understanding. We did get into the details pretty quickly, and I think that the picture for Working Group 1 became a little bit challenging to understand, but it all kind of came together near the conclusion in terms of what the overall picture of what an EDIM might look like. When it comes to Working Group 1, when we're focused on resource sufficiency, supply commitment, we really think about a few different elements. And the first one, recognizing that EDIM, as it's conceived, is not intended to consolidate balancing areas. The purpose of EDIM will not be a comprehensive optimization across the member footprint. Instead, participants would still have obligations for managing and retaining their compliance reserves, contingencies, and other components to ensure that they have total control over balancing area responsibilities and the reliability obligations that come from there. But there still is plenty of resources to optimize around those specific reserves. We recognize pretty quickly that because of the obligations to reliability as we work through optimizing resources across balancing areas, there is a need to make sure that we understand that there's sufficient capacity and that people come to the table fully prepared to serve their load. It's a concept that has been discussed and is foundational to EIM. We think it's even more foundational with respect to EDIM because we do start talking about the potential for decommitments of longer lead resources. The working group got pretty quickly into the weeds regarding a capacity test to try and validate and verify that there would be sufficient resources and that we would have confidence that the entire footprint would be able to optimize reliably around that. We discussed the concept of capacity tests and reviewed a variety of, I'll say, right-sized tests. Do we go for something that's a little bit more simplified and repeatable that covers a 24-hour period? or do we go for something really, really in-depth that maybe gets run by the ISO just ahead of the market? And, the discussion really kind of lent towards a more deployable test. It was good to see some consensus build around kind of the definition of what that capacity test looks like relatively early on. We moved from determining capacity, because it's not just enough to have the capacity across every hour, but we need to make sure that there is sufficient recognition of unit capabilities and how unit capabilities would be bid and reflected within the market. That one was fairly quick from an understanding as well. But we also explored the concept of what it really means to have energy limitations. And I think we had a robust discussion to reach the concept that there is a recognition that there will be a wide variety of resources, whether they're battery, whether they're pump back hydro, gas limited resources. Many resources are likely to have some form of daily or hourly energy or start limitation that needs to be reflected in the market. And those start to add significant complexity. But I'd say overall good discussion there, and expect kind of additional discussion as we move forward in terms of what is the best way to reflect that that's both efficient from an timely modeling and solution perspective relative to some of the nuances and uniqueness that occurs across any individual balancing area or specific resources themselves. The biggest challenge there will be making sure that we have ramping capability included as part of that, and making sure that we can kind of really move the resources around from an optimization perspective. As we referenced, the ensuring that we have sufficient capacity while balancing areas will be obligated to retain their own contingency reserves, and we're not going to be optimizing contingency reserves. There is an opportunity to optimize uncertainty within the footprint. And so that will be looking at both veer uncertainty as well as load uncertainty. And there was general consensus and understanding that that type of uncertainty could in fact be optimized across the footprint and would be a part of demonstrating that we are ready to meet our load across the uncertainty that materializes on a day-ahead basis. Once we moved from the details of the capacity test and the understanding and limitations of that, we really started to look at other aspects that go along with participating within the market or showing sufficiency within the market. And that was turning the conversation to a discussion about what happens if an entity fails the test on a day-ahead basis. And because there was general consensus and focus on kind of a 24-hour type of a test, you get into the details regarding failure consequences about what happens if I fail 1 hour out of 24. So there was a facilitated discussion exploring various aspects of, are we talking about similar provisions that are in EDIM or EIM with respect to kind of freezing transfers or kind of holding harmless? Are we talking about financial penalties to help explore through that? Or are we really talking about simply removing an entity for that period during the real-time environment? I would say there was lots of discussion there. We're interested to see what the options are that are presented within the straw proposal that comes out. But overall, really good, robust dialogue around what failure consequences could and should mean. We also spoke a little bit regarding what the resource requirements would be. We talk about how do we count storage resources, how do we actually treat variable energy resources within EDIM, and how we recognize some of the other constraints that I referenced earlier. We kind of brought it all to a close towards the end as we started focusing on some of the aspects of what the vision really is for EDIM. Is it a full extension of the entire day-ahead market that exists within California today, including the residual unit commitment process, including convergence and virtual bidding process? It seemed that there was general acknowledgement and understanding that a residual unit commitment process is likely to be substantially beneficial to operating an EDAM. There was less consensus and clarity in terms of where what the value of convergence and or virtual bidding would be across an EDAM footprint, at least on day one. So we expect to see some proposals and some options as part of that straw proposal that comes out towards the end of April. And really, we wrapped up the working group 1 concept with a discussion about the confidence of EDAM transfers. And this is something that has been an underlying question for several entities as we work from kind of what I'll say is the bilateral Mod 29 independent balancing area framework and trying to translate firmness and confidence in transfers for what we're accustomed to today to what we would expect to see in a day-ahead market that has central optimization and dispatch. And we ended with the last few meetings actually working through and facilitating discussions and examples to try and help provoke different questions about when we reach those incredibly scarce, unlikely scenarios where you're at the limits of what the market can solve. How do we prioritize load across the footprint? How do we prioritize transfers? And can we ultimately get confidence that EDAM transfers can be firm or would materialize in real time so that balancing areas that maintain that reliability aspect have the surety that scheduling coordinators within their balancing area can participate to the fullest extent to maximize the benefits for all EDAM participants. Overall, Working Group 1 covered a ton of ground. I know that was a fairly detailed explanation, but while we were able to reach consensus on some areas, it's clear that there are other areas where we were working to reach common understanding between California entities, non-California entities, and independent power producers in terms of where the issues might actually be. And holistically, it was a good discussion. And I'll leave it at that to see if there's any questions before I turn it back to Milos. Okay.
Question. This is Andy Campbell. Thanks, Bobby, for that overview. I wanted to follow up on what you were saying about some of the questions about kind of whether this would be a full extension of the California ISO day-ahead market, and that kind of raised some questions which are probably too early to answer. But I mean, is it possible that the kind of what EDAM is could either EDAM will sort of change over time? There could be additional elements added to the market over time, or is it also possible there could be individual participants could participate in just certain pieces of the market? So I'm trying to think about the scope, which sort of question is up around governance.
Sure. No, I think that's a great question, Andy. Appreciate it. It's to be candid, I think the discussion wasn't centered around optionality for individual participants within an EDAM. It was more centered around the concept of what is the progression and evolution of the market. Is it all elements on day one? Is there kind of more of a roadmap in terms of what a day 2, day 3 aspect might look like for the market? And really ensuring that, I'll say, non-California participants today have an opportunity to understand, explore, and really identify where the benefits are. I mean, candidly, if you look at the day-ahead market as it exists today, that was an evolution in and of itself. And so trying to think about how that's evolved, what was the growing pains and learning through that, and then what's the process that you have to take to apply similar products to an external footprint, new entities, working through the same elements that were previously kind of explored and worked through. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Lisa Tani. I'll jump in with a quick question if that's okay, Therese. I want to let you chair. Okay. This is a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciated Andrew's question because I think it goes to this challenge around the scope that is going to be really critical. I'm curious, you spoke at the end of your description about running some scenarios for those scarce days and really seeking out that firmness. And I think one of the things we've really struggled with outside of the ISO, for those of us who are deeper in the bilateral world, sort of comparing, trying to do that translation apples to apples. And I'm curious, as you were having that discussion in the work group, do you feel like there was a real, like the bilateral world doesn't always work out perfectly either, right? And so, right, like, were you comparing, did you feel like you were doing kind of an apples to apples translation, or do we need to find some ways to bring in some of be realistic about some of the limitations and so on that we have in the bilateral world when we have a scarce day? Does that make sense?
It does. So what I would say is most of the examples helped in trying to help map out kind of a translation between EDIM versus how the bilateral world works today. I think for a large portion of concern, it really was trying to get across that translation between how the two entities or kind of the two different paradigms function. I would say that the working group 1 meeting really concluded with what I would say is an aha moment for myself. I won't speak for others in terms of what and how that mapped. So oftentimes when we think of bilateral transactions, we think of them as firm physical, firm financial, especially from like a day ahead perspective. But as you referenced, there are many things that can kind of complicate and get in the way as you work through that real-time type of environment. The aha moment for me was when CAISO walked through their examples to try and identify that the concept of firmness in the organized market is not the same concept it is in a bilateral perspective. It's really about priority. When we talk about entities in this organized market, you're really talking about, well, what's the relative priority of load from one entity to the next? How are you prioritizing transfers and balancing out load obligations between the entities that are participating? And that was the aha moment for me, because today in the bilateral construct with individual balancing areas, it really is, I'll say, self-centered, self-focused in terms of what our obligations are, not necessarily how our load prioritizes relative to others. So the paradigm shift for me was recognizing that in an EDIM construct, in order for it to be successful, you have to get to a concept that starts to look at load parity across participants. And when we think about load parity, what does that ultimately mean with respect to rulemaking and participants' ability to weigh into how that rulemaking gets set up and how equitable it is across all participants? I hope that helps.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting and really a helpful way to bring it back to the GRC's issues. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. Actually, that last part, I've noted it and highlighted it because when you talk about, rulemaking, so that might be important for us to think about in scope, exactly as Commissioner Tani mentioned. I just have a question, which I think is maybe a softball. Just want to make sure I'm thinking about it the same way. When you talked about resource efficiency and you thought about the simple and the complex, and ultimately you came to this consensus about what was really a more deployable test. Related to governance, right, we think a lot about the balancing authority obligations for adequacy and their obligations. I assume the test that you came to consensus on really still preserves all the balancing authority areas independence in terms of their adequacy approach and all of those issues. Is that a fair assumption?
It is a fair assumption. So part of the test, it's assumed that the balancing area obligations are still reflected within that test. It's identified and clear that they have the capability of meeting that. And that when we look at kind of bids and participation, there's an expectation that while the balancing area has the obligation to kind of maintain those reserves, they have the ability to identify how those reserves are captured as part of, I'll say, bidding into and participating in the market so that the market doesn't unintentionally redispatch those reserves outside of the framework of maintaining reliability.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is Milos. If there are no more questions, then for Bobby and Working Group 1, Bobby, thank you very much. Really appreciate the thorough update. Let's go to then Kevin Smith, representing Bank, Balancing Authority area of Northern California, on Working Group 2 update.
Hey, Milos and members, can you hear me? Just doing a quick check here. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I've been technologically challenged today, so thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to provide a little bit of perspective. Before kind of diving into transmission, which, I'll try to provide a little bit of a flyover of how we chose to approach, a pretty complex topic, and we formed a methodology which I think allowed us to kind of tackle it, piece by piece, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I did want to start, with a little bit of maybe a compliment and kind of a kudo for the approach that was taken in this, development process, and really what was a very, I'll call it a labor-intensive and very time-consuming, but very valuable process, because a lot of us have been talking about these concepts for a while as EIM entities. We've had various discussions. Of course, this all was being developed for quite some time, and then we had, a big event in August of 2020 that kind of put a big wall in the middle of the discussion, and we were able to restart discussions again this last summer. But a lot of the concepts, that were developed over time, through this process, frankly, have actually turned quite a bit, and maybe even we hadn't considered certain things, even though, we thought we had covered off on a lot of these issues, but, we all had to amend maybe some of our views on things. I think Bobby did just a great job capturing, some of the evolution of thought, and even as he noted, the aha moments. Well, we've been having aha moments throughout the whole process because this is super complicated. We have a lot of great stakeholders that are on, some of which are on the call right now, with a lot of insights, and, ideas that we thought were good weren't or had to evolve or change. So, but what I think the CAISO's process here is a good template going forward, rather than kind of going into a bunker and developing straw proposals, which, it always sought input. So I don't want to be unfair there, but this was kind of a new way of developing something with a lot more input on the front end. And hopefully that'll pay dividends, as we move forward into the stakeholder process. So I thought Milos and others, Phil and just the whole group did a really good job. And I wanted to compliment that because, from our perspective, and I represent the Balancing Authority of Northern California, I mean, we've had our moments with the CAISO over the years, and that's why we're a separate BA. But we have, this has been a really good experience. EIM's been a good experience for Bank. And I thought it was important that for the members of this group to, continue to encourage these more open and transparent discussions, because I think they've been very valuable to the market. And I've heard nothing but positive out of this process. Of course, we all have different views of the feasibility and end product, but the process has been very well handled. So I want that compliment to be registered. I'm going to give a real high-level flyover of transmission. Again, another very complex topic. I don't pretend to be the expert on this. There are a lot of really smart people involved in this. I know Kathy Anderson from Idaho has been very instrumental, Dave Rubin from Nevada, and then, of course, a lot of the stakeholders and CAISO staff and so forth. So far more expertise exists outside of me. I'm just going to give you kind of the high level and just I want to identify maybe the aha moments in this as well, but also where we see that there's going to need to be some work. Again, a very complicated topic. What we decided to do to try to capture or approach the elephant, so to speak, is to break it up into how we might, as transmission service providers and other market participants might view transmission. We came up with what we affectionately called a bucket design. There were three general buckets. You could argue numerous sub-buckets within the buckets, but quickly, bucket one really is the transmission associated with what Bobby's referencing, and that is the resource sufficiency, how participants are coming to the market with their own transmission and resources, but in this case, transmission to meet their RS obligation. And I'm also going to talk about the compensation after I run through this. But this is kind of the sunk cost transmission. It's what we would do, and oversimplifying it a bit, I would say it's kind of the but-for case. If we didn't have an EDIM, how would we meet our load obligations? And then, of course, on top of that, you're layering in the uncertainty and flexibility and other things that come with being part of the broader market. But it's really the assets and resources that we come to the table with. So bucket one is fairly straightforward. And of course, because of that, it's not compensated. It's already been paid for by customers. And so this is where it was very simple to just have a kind of a reciprocity type understanding. Bucket two is the transmission that we've identified is it's held under contract at transfer points between EDIM areas and can be made voluntarily available. But just to make it more simple, especially for those entities that are transmission service providers and other balancing authorities, it's the transmission that other third parties have either acquired through purchasing off of Oasis through your OAT process, or these could even be pre-existing contracts that predate, open access or other OAT type arrangements. So this is a pretty big category, and frankly, we thought this was going to be probably the hardest issue to tackle, and primarily because what do you do with third-party transmission that's unscheduled? And I'm going to circle back and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then bucket three is the unsold ATC that a transmission service provider traditionally posts on its Oasis. And this transmission would be made available, at least the initial design, and we're amending our thinking a little bit on this, or at least we're looking at different options. But the bucket three is transmission that has been unsold as of the start of the day-ahead market. So in our case, at 10 a.m. roughly, or it could be 9 a.m. And that transmission, if it has not been sold off Oasis, would be put into the CAISO optimization at what we call hurdle rate, which is really your OAT rate, or it could be a discount rate, but it would have to be offered generally. and then that transmission could be optimized if the ISO's market optimization could reach that level of the hurdle rate, because this would be cost-based transmission, so it may or may not get optimized. And if it doesn't, then it could be returned to the transmission service provider and reposted for availability, for other bilateral type sales. So those are the three high-level buckets. And maybe I'll pause really quickly, Milos, or should I just run through some of the issues, compensation, and how we propose to do compensation, as well as some of the key issues of challenge? Your preference.
My suggestion would be you cover, whatever else the topics remain, and then I think we can open it up for questions.
Sounds good. Thank you. So bucket one, again, it wasn't really a big challenge. I think the aha moment in that is really what matters is transfer capability between balancing authority areas, or EDIM areas. And not all entities are bringing transmission for purposes of their load serving or meeting their RS test that has robust transfer capability with other EDIM balancing authority areas. So there may be, at one point, we thought the majority of transmission and market liquidity would be provided through bucket one. But I think as we looked at it, there were some deficiencies. Not all EDIM entities have those significant transmission transfers that could be made available. And so it forces more emphasis on maybe some of the other transmission buckets that can be made available. Bucket two, we thought was going to probably be the biggest challenge, which again, this gets to parties that hold transmission firm point to point, for example, and what do we do with that transmission in the market? And I think the challenge is those who are involved with CAISO early on understand that there was always this notion of phantom congestion, and a market optimization, doesn't like big blank spots that aren't being utilized or scheduled on, and so it can create inefficiencies and so forth. So the question was, well, can the CAISO optimize transmission that's held by a third party under an OAT or perhaps under an existing contract if it's unscheduled at, let's say, for example, 10 a.m. day ahead. And the discussion focused around that, and I think a general concept is that many of us believe that having that transmission made available, we believe it's consistent with FERC order and rules around open access by 10 a.m., as long as that entity can come back and potentially schedule on it if it's still available, or just have that, maintain that right, that the market optimization, it would be better if that transmission was made available. Then the question gets down to, okay, if that entity does come back, who pays those uplifts for redispatch if that's necessary to accommodate that use? And so I think one of the areas that we've kind of hovered around has been making transmission available, but what do we do about the costs that are going to end up being allocated back to that service providers, customers, potentially? And so those are issues that still need to be resolved, but I think there's a general consensus that we need to make this transmission available. The other question is around compensation, and generally speaking, we were hoping that maybe a congestion or an allocation of revenue from transfer revenue for that right. Let's say an entity, third party, decides that it wants to make it available to the market. There would be a mechanism for that to be done, and they would be awarded the congestion rent from that bucket 2 transmission. That is the incentive structure that we think is a good starting point, but there are issues that have come up and questions about making this available at some kind of a incentivized rate, a hurdle rate or something else, but there is a little bit of a challenge with that, and it could be a little more complicated. And so at least some of us think that maybe on a day one, it would be better to just have transfer revenue available to those entities that make it available. Right now, there is an existing structure in the CAISO tariff that allows an entity to turn over transmission, and I believe it's on a monthly basis, and receive the transfer rent, congestion rent from that. So there is kind of an existing paradigm that supports that, but whether that provides sufficient incentive or liquidity in the market is really a question, and I think that's something that we may have to adjust, but it may be something that's worth observing. I think the big challenge is around bucket 3. It didn't appear to be a challenge at first, and frankly, we looked at it as EIM entities mainly from the outside of the table, not as much from the CAISO side, and there is an asymmetry between how our transmission is compensated and how the CAISO's transmission is compensated and made available. Of course, CAISO is a flow-based system, and there are no reservations point to point, and now we're kind of marrying these two up. And so how do we deal with the compensation piece? I think we originally thought that the ATC would be made available at the hurdle rate, but we never looked at it from the CAISO side, which doesn't have the same mechanism. And there's clearly an asymmetry in hurdle rates when the CAISO's wheeling access charge or TAC is significantly higher than most OAT rates. So I think there's going to be a lot more thinking that's going to have to go into that, and possibly another approach. Maybe it's a market uplift charge to ensure there's relative transmission revenue neutrality for transmission service providers. But that's one that we are going to be revisiting, I think, quite a bit, and there'll probably need to be several options laid out in the CAISO straw proposal. And there'll be a lot of discussions going on among various parties, I think, on that topic. So those are the big design challenges that exist within the bucket system. And I'm going to pause there and ask if there are any questions, and there may be others who want to comment as well. And then I'll just touch really quickly on transfer revenue allocation, which is not my wheelhouse, but I'm just going to provide a high level on that as well.
All right, I think you can keep going, Kevin. Sounds like no questions yet.
So the other topic that was in group 2 was the congestion allocation or transfer revenue allocation. I think one of the key kind of grounding principles there was we don't want EDIM, and this goes for resource efficiency and all aspects. We don't want the EDIM to dictate or interfere with existing practices. And so there's a kind of a division between how CAISO funds and supports its existing congestion revenue rights. And so the EDIM is really the allocations is primarily addressing the EDIM entity to EDIM entity transfers which occur based on EDIM operations. And so, we came up with some equitable allocations, which we think are fairly rational. A lot of this was done through very detailed and tedious discussions with spreadsheets and other things, most of which flew over some of the, at least lawyers like me's head. But the bottom line is I think we reached a fairly solid place where most entities are comfortable, but primarily around the issue if you have a shared path between two EDIM entities and, both are contributing to the transfer, that any revenues that are resulting from that, transfer revenues that are developed from the price differences would be shared between those two EDIM entities. If one EDIM entity comes and provides the entire transfer path, then they would get 100% of the allocated revenues of that transfer. So that's just kind of the high level. I don't think there's going to be, I think CAISO is going to have to develop and probably provide a little more data on that. I know there was a lot of interest in running through the numbers, but I didn't see a lot of shifts that were occurring as far as in thinking. And so I think that one came out. It's a little less variability in where it's going to end up, I think, but that's just my personal opinion on it. Milos, that's really all I have.
Right. Thank you, Kevin. And just for folks, I am mindful of time and how much we have left on the presentation. So I don't know if there are any questions for Kevin on Working Group 2. If not, we can get a brief update from Mary on Working Group 3. But let's see if there are any questions for Kevin. Okay, if not, thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate you as well providing the update. If we can go to Mary Winke with the Public Generating Pool to just give us a brief update on Working Group 3.
Mary, just make sure your line is unmuted on your end. Also WebEx. Are you able to unmute Mary's line by chance?
There we go. Thank you. I wasn't able to unmute myself there. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
We can. Thank you.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. And Milos, how much time should I try to take up here? I know I'm not sure what else you have on the agenda after this.
I just need 10 minutes at the 10 minutes to just do an overview of our comments and next steps. I could even do it in 5.
Okay, I will try to do a little presentation here in 10 minutes or less, and then hopefully we'll just have a few minutes for comments left over within that time frame, Therese. So the group that I'm giving an update on today was tackling the issue of greenhouse gas costs in EDIM, and this is really a kind of a brand new issue in this space. This is the first time that there was a lot of public stakeholders discussion on this issue. It's a little bit more focused than I think some of the broader issues in some of the other working groups, but also I think has a lot of challenges and elements to it that are not necessarily implicated in the other groups. So I think it was actually really great to have this effort. I think it really brought out some really complex issues that are good to have. There was really a real benefit, I think, in having a real public discourse on this topic. And the group really, I think, started out spending a fair amount of time in the first couple of work groups really kind of coming up to speed and coalescing around what the issues were, what the objectives are, what are we really trying to solve with this working group. And I think that was really worthwhile to really kind of bring the group and together sort of up to speed and conversant on some of the challenges associated with the greenhouse gas issue. And one of the first sort of things that the working group tried to tackle was what was the problem we're really trying to solve. And there's issues of greenhouse gas costs in a market, and then there's also issues of greenhouse gas and to a certain extent clean energy accounting and clean energy tracking that are implicated in this conversation. And fundamentally, I think the real question is, and this question the group did not try to answer, but this question of, how does the market reflect individual state policies, where the market is intended to be interstate, wholesale electric market? How do individual state policies around carbon pricing, around fuel type preferences that are expressed in state policies, how is that reflected, and whether that is reflected in a wholesale electric market or organized market? And as I mentioned, the group didn't attempt to kind of tackle that really big picture issue, and I think kind of settled into focusing really on the implementation in the market of policies that specifically price carbon. So really focusing on California's cap and trade program and focused in on Washington's pending cap and trade program. And the question with those programs and their impact on kind of pricing in the market. And the kind of fundamental challenge is that both of those programs, California's already does this, and Washington's will do this, is placing a price on imports and on imported emissions. And that creates a real challenge because you don't necessarily know ahead of time what types of energy are going to be imported into a particular jurisdiction. And creating kind of the right price signals that send a message to the market relative to those imports, and attempting to incorporate a carbon price into the dispatch for energy that will be imported into those jurisdictions without creating a carbon price or inappropriately affecting states and entities in states that have not adopted those same policies. And so real challenging, kind of sticky issues that this group is really working on tackling. And so I think there was a lot of discussion around a lot of accounting issues as well. But I think at the end of the day, the group really decided kind of the near term kind of focused issue to look at was really this issue that I was talking about associated with pricing and costs that are incorporated into the market design associated with greenhouse gas. And following kind of that, a little bit of level setting on those objectives and what we're going to focus on, there was also then spent some time really coming up to speed and learning and looking at what is in place today in the EIM. The CAISO has undergone processes in the past to look at this issue and come up with solution that is implemented currently in the EIM, and talking through kind of, okay, what are the ways that proposal can be changed to reflect, or should be changed to reflect a day-ahead market, and then whether or not the group wanted to consider alternatives to that approach. So there was a lot of discussion about kind of how it currently works in the EIM, and for those unfamiliar with that approach, essentially it's a resource-specific attribution where the CAISO is able to use GHG bid adders to dispatch and identify the resources that are being used to support transfers into California. And the CAISO worked on and developed a proposal specific to EDIM that would incorporate that same approach for EDIM, and then also would incorporate the Washington program to reflect the two different states that have those greenhouse gas prices. And it's assumed, by the way, the group assumed for purposes of this exercise that those programs would not be linked by the time that EDIM was going to be implemented. I think that's an open question, but that was what the group landed on in terms of the assumption that it was going to be making that those programs would not be linked initially, even if at some point in the future they are linked. But so looking for a solution that works in light of not having an immediate linkage between those programs. There were some participants that raised concerns with the expanding the EIM approach to EDIM. I would say I would characterize those concerns kind of in two large buckets. One has to do with, I think, the role of the market operator in this space, and the market operator essentially assigning specific resources to loads. And while entities may have the ability to manage that to a certain extent through bid strategy, at the end of the day, the CAISO is using those, using the market engine to identify those, which resources are going to which load. And I think that's a concern potentially for entities who have future clean energy requirements that they are looking to plan to comply with. And states like Washington has already looked at, a resource-specific attribution of a zero-emitting resource to California as something that where the associated REC does not count for the RPS or clean energy standard in that state. So just having some concern about kind of the market playing that role of really assigning resources to loads for that reason. And then the other concern that was raised with the CAISO's current approach is something that is referred to as secondary dispatch, which is a form of leakage that, and to step back a second too, the leakage is something that is a natural outgrowth of a single state imposing a carbon price, where the rest of the market footprint doesn't have that carbon price. So you're going, without sort of corrective action, you're going to have leakage in a wholesale energy market where one state is pricing carbon and other states are not, because you're going to shift generation to emitting resources that do not have that carbon price. And so the concept is to have a solution that works to mitigate that leakage effect that is kind of a natural outgrowth of having only one state or two states with carbon pricing and a larger regional footprint. So secondary dispatch is one form of leakage where you have essentially clean or non-emitting resources being directed to the greenhouse gas jurisdiction, California or Washington, while then emitting resources are incremented to serve load in that external area. And so there's a concern with the current EIM approach that some entities raised that the approach as it applies to EDIM would continue to allow for a level of secondary dispatch. So one of the things too I want to emphasize that this group talks about a lot is that there's not a perfect solution. We are looking for something that will work and will be something that is implementable and effective, effective for the most part for achieving the objectives that the group wanted to achieve. But I think some real acknowledgement that there's no way to do this perfectly, where you really have individual state policies that cannot be implemented across the entire footprint. So following the discussion of the approach in EIM and expanding that to EDIM, the group also talked about a different approach, which is referred to as the zonal or unspecified approach, which would do something different than what the CAISO's proposed expansion of the specified approach. And the zonal approach would look to apply a different treatment for clean resources that are external to the greenhouse gas jurisdiction. such that you are treating those external resources and dispatching them as if they are internal. So you would have a definition of a greenhouse gas zone that expands beyond the physical, physical location or being physically located inside Washington or California. So effectively, if you have a entity who has contracted with a long-term resource that's outside of California, you have the option to be able to treat that resource as non-emitting, as if it were internal to that jurisdiction. There's some complication around being able to implement that, and in particular around implementing it for kind of resources that are not fully committed to serve load inside Washington or California, kind of a partial, where you have a portion of a resource is committed to serve load inside Washington and California, but a portion is not. And we are still working through some of those details. But then anything that's not identified as being within that expanded greenhouse gas area would then have an unspecified hurdle rate applied to it, such that you are working to mitigate that leakage by creating a hurdle that external resources have to overcome if they want to be imported. So a little bit of a different approach there, and a lot of discussion in the group on kind of the pros and cons of the different approaches. And what we understand is that CAISO is going to move forward with its straw proposal with both approaches in it, so that stakeholders can have further discussion and further contemplation over kind of which approach might ultimately work better, though not perfectly, as I mentioned. So I will stop there, and looks like we have about 4 minutes for any kind of questions. Andy, you have a question?
If that's okay. I have actually 2 questions. They're not specifically for Mary, but they're for the presenters. And just kind of thoughts that have come together listening to all these presentations. So I guess one question, thinking back to really Milos talking about the timeline and thinking about the go live period, are there any thoughts at this stage whether the market would be sort of, every entity who's ever going to participate in it kind of joining the market all at once, or whether it's something like the EIM market that's been through a series of decisions over time has expanded? I'm wondering if there's any thoughts on which of those scenarios is more likely.
This is Milos. Maybe I'll start, and then others can offer their perspectives as well. But I believe it'll be more akin, likely, to the EIM, where parties will gradually join. There may be some entities that join day one based on the design, and recognizing that all of these parties have to go through their own stakeholder processes and evaluations. But I anticipate it will be gradual over time approach.
Thank you. Then another question relates maybe to both supply commitment and transmission commitment. But in the EIM market, there's currently an entity can terminate participation with 180 days notice. I was wondering if there's kind of issues that are surfacing around supply, transmission, or other issues that are kind of maybe informing, like the notice period for the EDIM market, or suggesting it should be longer, shorter, similar, or is it kind of too early to say?
Andrew, maybe I'll give it a shot as well, and then if Kevin or Bobby want to jump in. We didn't necessarily talk about that topic within the working groups. I think, as we're developing the proposal, at least from the ISO side, we see that probably a commensurate time frame of 6 months seems like a reasonable starting point. But that's something that we'll be seeking stakeholder feedback on as well. If there are certain things that we didn't consider that maybe requires a potentially a different time frame for exiting. But we're envisioning a kind of likely a 6-month exit notice period similar to the EIM.
So this is Kevin. I'll just comment really quickly. Andrew, you asked a good question. I think it's absolutely clear in my mind that this will be a very, I don't want to say a trickling, but you'll need to have a critical mass of a certain amount of entities that are willing to move forward. I think others, just like EIM, I mean, we sat on the fence, actually threw a couple grenades initially. So, you know, the reality is that, you know, every entity is going to have much bigger hurdles, and, you know, there's politics involved. There's another potential market developing as well. So I think there will be, you know, if this comes to fruition, there will be probably a smaller handful of entities that are willing to, you know, see how this might work. I think we're pretty bullish on it personally, but we may change our perspective, you know, as the design comes together. So I do think that, and I think what we want to do is maintain a fairly easy, simple exit type of process. You know, a fairly short fuse to allow parties, you know, we don't think it needs to be, you know, years or other things to exit or enter, just keeping it close to what EIM would already require, because there shouldn't be significantly more entanglements. We're not turning over transmission or anything like that. So.
Thanks, Kevin. This is Therese. I think to the extent that exit provisions or commitments moving from a voluntary to more of a firm longer-term commitment, anything like that, changes in market design, that is important to the governance review committee. Exit provisions, voluntary aspects were pretty important in our previous conversations. So that's another area where we just want to flag. I have one question for Mary. Mary, I'm curious how many state regulatory staff were in the work groups. Did you feel like you had good participation from, in particular, the California and Washington regulatory folks?
So the California Air Resources Board staff participated, and they did give a presentation at one point, and the Department of Ecology also came and gave a presentation, but Ecology did not participate. I would say, though, that just highlights a challenge in this effort, is that it's kind of iterative. You know, the market design has to reflect the policies, but then the policy has to reflect the market design, and you can't really design the market to fit a specific policy that it was designed for the bilateral market. So it's kind of challenging in terms of identifying what's something that TISO or this group should be looking at versus what the state regulator should be really directing.
Yes, noted. That's a good point. Okay, last chance for any of the GRC members. Do you have questions from Milos or any of the presenters today? And really, thank you to all four of you, Mary, Kevin, Bobby, and Milos. This has been really helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to do a speed run through of the few things that we thought might be helpful for folks kind of following the governance review committee process. I'm going to do a faster than I thought overview of the comments that we received, and then tell you about what our next steps are. So we can go to the next slide. We received 16 sets of comments. If you recall, we asked a question last time we asked 4 main questions and asked for stakeholder feedback. We got 16 sets of comments. Some of them were, you know, combined joint comments. I want to thank all of the commenters. They were very thoughtful and constructive, and there's a lot of useful input for us to consider. The first question was on the timing of the GRC proposals relative to the EDIM market design. We had proposed in our general session in February that we do this in parallel, that we kind of try to stay on a track that kind of closely follows the market design, and there was very consistent support for that. And then a couple of important comments that people made. several commenters want to be sure that we do not put a governance proposal forward to the joint boards for approval without the EDIM market design, that those go together and that we assure that they go together. Even if we maybe have settled, and commenters didn't say this, but this is how I would interpret it, even if maybe we've settled on some governance concepts, that we hold until there's final market design and that they go forward together. The other thing that came through in a couple of comments is that they want to ensure that the GRC remains available until the final market design approval, and recognizing that the market design might change as it goes through for final approval, and that may have an impact on governance. So to be prepared for that, and to just have the GRC remain available. A couple of process recommendations: recognize the significant workload associated with the market design, not only in those work groups, but now in the comment process that's going to occur on the straw proposal, and then also to the extent that we can post materials in advance, have more general session meetings, and provide sufficient comment period. We have been taking that into account and trying to improve that as we go along. So if we can go to the next slide. One of the questions that we asked was, what governance elements are implicated by the EDIM market design? There's two summary slides on this. One is kind of some thematic things that we heard, and then the second is some more specific things. And pretty consistently, we heard from potential EDIM participants that EDIM will have a much greater impact on the market and participants than the Western EIM. And there is a pretty consistent interest by non-ISO members for a governance structure that's independent from California appointment process. Now, they recognize that that's not in the scope of the GRC authority, but wanted to be sure that we understood that that really is their ideal governance structure. And recognizing that that's their ideal governance structure, a recommendation that as we look for options that are within our scope, that we consider how they might support or advance future governance that would be free from the California appointment process. And the suggestion that we put a governance roadmap together that identifies the role of this effort relative to any path to a potential legislative change. It's kind of embedded in the middle here, but I want to pull this out that there were comments from folks within California and from ISO members that recognize joint authority as a good balance between the risks of the voluntary participants of EDIM and those that are mandatory participants in the ISO. And so we did receive kind of different themes from those that would be non-ISO members and those that are current ISO members. If you go to the next slide, so when you get to this concept of how to look at EDIM governance, there were a wide range of comments about how to look at delegation of authority. And when we evaluate delegation of authority, we look at both the type, how that authority is delegated, and then the scope of what's delegated. You can delegate in a primary authority where you give to the governing body primary decision authority, or you can do joint authority between the ISO Board of Governors and the governing body. We received comments for both, to pursue primary authority. We received comments to say continue with joint authority or even build upon joint authority. Similarly, we received comments for a wide range of consideration of the scope of delegation. So what actually gets delegated, whether it's primary, joint, you still have the question of what gets delegated, whether it would be the same thing that is in place today for EIM rules that apply to EDIM participants. We did receive comments that there may be some rules that don't apply to EDIM participants but have a significant impact on EDIM participants, and some suggestions that maybe there's an impact test or a way to evaluate those things that have high impact, and that those should, that the governing body should have decision authority on those. And then other comments that said just all day ahead and all real-time market rules because they're too integrated to break them apart. And then we received a lot of comments on the evaluation, or recommended that we evaluate the role of stakeholders, the body of state regulators, and RIF, with some recommending a more stakeholder-driven structure for development of proposals. And similar to what we kind of talked about in the last round, some commenters recommended looking again at governing body input on issue selection and the Market Surveillance Committee and Department of Market Monitoring activities. I realize I have 1 minute, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So we didn't get a lot of input on the legal questions, but suggestion that they really like that we asked this question and would like us to keep considering it. There are just a few of the specific questions that we received, but we're going to continue more work. And then if we go to the next slide. The next slide. And then this is the category of other comments, a whole lot of other comments that we are taking into consideration. So if you go to the next slide, we have as a GRC broken into subgroups where we are looking at detail at these comments and coming up with options and ideas. But before we can evaluate those options and ideas, we want to revise our guiding principles for how we evaluate any governance modifications. And we're doing that revision based on some of the input we received. The subgroups will continue to evaluate the comments, look at options, and we've got a meeting scheduled for April 29th, a general session meeting to talk with all of you about those options. And so we'll do then further sector-based outreach in May, and we're targeting a straw proposal for June. We also just want to say this GRC is a very diverse group of stakeholders. That's who we are. We really are all of you. And so any one of us that you know and that you want to talk to, please feel free to call us at any time. So it's not just set to general session meetings or conversations. We really do want to interact with you about different ideas and concepts that you have. And if we go to the next slide, this is draft. Anything beyond June is draft. Actually, anything beyond May is kind of draft. And so part of this is similar to what they're doing on market design. We will iterate, but what we do know is April 29th, we'll have a general session meeting to talk about different options. We'll talk about our principles for how we evaluate different options, and then targeting a straw proposal in June, and then beyond that, based on stakeholder comments. We're 2 minutes over. Thank you for those of you that stayed for the extra 2 minutes. I am happy to stay and take questions if there are questions from anybody on the phone, or if there are any comments that the other GRC members want to make. Operator, you can go ahead and open the line to see if anybody has any questions or comments.
Okay, it looks like we do have one caller in queue. And caller, go ahead.
Hey, Trace and members there. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Great presentation. I'll try to make this really quick. We're over time. Just in reading through a lot of the comments, something popped back into my head from the discussions that we had in early 2020, and that was this issue that came up in that first review cycle that kind of fell off the map, or I think was maybe kicked over to the RIF, that was a WEIM and some of the IPP community brought forward around the potential for the governing body to have oversight of entity open access transmission tariffs to help ensure consistency, trying to prevent seams issues, or prevent undermining the market design or efficiency if you have just sort of fundamental differences showing up in the tariffs that are implemented. And it seemed like with some of the discussion in the working groups and what could get deferred down to the TSPs and BAs, that it may be important to consider that again for EDIM. And I'm just curious if the GRCs had any discussion about bringing that back up in this round, or if maybe that's something we'll get to talking about later on in the year.
Thanks, Dan. We haven't had any specific discussion about it this time. I do recall conversation that we had last time was market design is an important part of the conversation where there needs to be consistency to identify those areas. But I think we've got your question noted, and we'll have the conversation again.
Okay, thanks.
Operator, any other questions or comments?
At this time, I do not see any more callers in queue.
Well, thank you to everyone. Thanks for the couple of extra minutes. We appreciate your participation and look forward to seeing you next time on April 29th.
That concludes the conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.